Hello, welcome to Soccer 101, Society and Culture, Introduction to Sociology. I'm Steve Threadgold. So what I'm doing today is presenting the lecture material for the first week of content in Soccer 101. We're going to break it up into three parts. What is sociology, sociological themes, and sociological imagination. So let's get started on part one. What is sociology? One of the kind of quips we use to get you thinking critically about the world is that in sociology, one of the things we want you to kind of think of by the end of the course, a way of thinking about the world, is to make the normal look strange. And there's already things you probably engage with on a day-to-day basis that kind of does this already. Things like memes, things like satire, comedy, cartoons, art, all these kind of things engage sometimes with the world critically in a way to try and reveal some of the hidden things that are going on. And so throughout the course, we'll be looking at things like this. In the week on digital sociology, for instance, we'll be looking at memes and GIFs and how they work and how they can kind of make the normal look strange. In the examples that I have on the screen here at the moment, for instance, we can think of gender relations here. The movie, when the female version of Ghostbusters that came out a few years ago had all kinds of men whinging about that kind of stuff, but really if you wanted to kind of think about it critically, as the kind of cartoon points out there, it's likely that the female Ghostbusters would be earning about 78% of what a man would earn in a similar role. In terms of media structures and framing, the example down there with Elise Perry and David Warner is kind of one of my favourite examples of making the normal look strange. At the Allen Border Medal one year, Elise Perry won the best female player, David Warner won the best male player. You can see the actual photo of them there in real life, where Elise Perry's quite a bit taller than David Warner. But for some reason, the Australian newspaper had to make David Warner taller than Elise Perry when they put it on the front page. You can see here that they're almost deliberately replicating masculine and feminine stereotypes there. So we'll look at aspects of gender relations throughout the course. We'll look at that in terms of media and all kinds of other stuff as well. We can think of the same kind of media framing when it comes to race relations. When Hurricane Katrina happened in the US, in Florida, many years ago now, there was examples, for instance, of people looting. And when white people were doing it, they were kind of presented as people kind of going to find food for their family, and when black people were doing it, they were said they were looting. So you can see just very same acts were kind of reported differently using different language. The one up in the corner there is a good example of how crime's reported. If you're a CEO of a major company committing fraud that can cost $3 billion and hundreds of people's livelihoods or whatever, you're likely to get a small sentence, often sentenced to home detention. If you're a homeless person stealing bread for your family, $100 or whatever, you're much more likely to get a more serious sentence, particularly if you're a repeat offender. $3 billion worth $100. We can kind of think about the structures of that throughout the course. The one down the corner there is a pretty famous photo now, used to think about how political protesting has changed. Throughout the Western world, increasingly governments have made protesting increasingly harder to do, made it more illegal. Cops turn up at all kinds of protests now. In fact, for many of them, you've got to actually apply for a permit, which seems to be against much of the kind of democratic rights that our societies are kind of built upon. And then they're often reported on as being violent or being confrontations. But as the kind of meme says there, you can see who came to be violent or riot by the ones that are dressed up for it. So the relationship in the course here, we'll be thinking quite critically about things that are defined as criminal or things that are defined as deviant, and the way that kind of power structures set up those kind of binaries, and we'll think critically about who benefits from that. The thing there from the Australian Institute that kind of gets us to think about how we think about the economy. In Australia, for instance, the general population has a massively kind of overestimate of how much mining, coal mining in particular, contributes to the GDP. As the stats there point out, it's only 2.2% and just 0.4% of workers. Yet we have a kind of understanding of 12.5%. About a decade ago, people thought it made up about a quarter. So why is that? Again, it's because powerful interests tend to have more influence on how things are reported, how norms are created. Again, this is something we'll look at in quite some detail throughout the course. Some other examples here. We'll look a little bit at the idea of consumption throughout the course. The politics of consumption over the past 20 years has been seen as something that individuals can do to express their politics, to make a difference in the world, and that's certainly the case in many ways. But, if we think about it more critically, start doing the math a little bit, the ownership of your phone, for instance, will take, many cups of free trade coffee or whatever in terms of the recycling and that kind of stuff to kind of make up for that kind of thing. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't have things like smartphones, and we need them, are essentially a key tool in day-to-day life, but we don't really think critically too much about what's going on, where those things are made. The coltan, for instance, is mined in Africa, often by 14-year-old slaves, in terms of the economic footprint of the way these things are constructed and move around the world. The normalcy of these kind of things have all kinds of knock-on effects for people, particularly in what we call the global south, or what we call, in this course, the majority world. We can think a little bit here about how AI is being rammed down our throats at the moment by these huge multinational corporations that kind of make up what we call platform capitalism. It's not really even ironic that they are kind of doing a bunch of things with these things that we don't really need or want. Things they should be doing, things that Shanghai is good at, things that create value, don't really overlap with the things that they're actually doing. At the moment, we have a huge AI kind of economic bubble that many critical economists and sociologists are predicting is going to bust, and it's going to have all kinds of knock-on effects for the economy. We want to question why this kind of piece of technology is being almost forced upon us every time you open up your computer. You're probably aware of the kind of institutional comparisons. Anyone that knows the Pink Floyd song Another Brick in the Wall will probably understand aspects of this already. We can think critically about institutions, and we'll be doing a lot of that in the course. For instance, the meme there kind of looks at the very similar things that happens between schools and prisons, particularly the disciplinary aspects of those things, and we'll be looking at that in some detail throughout the course. From a critical sociological perspective, even something as simple as the experience of time can be thought of to make the normal look strange. So obviously, it's kind of things are normally done in certain parts of the day. So like if people coming out of a nightclub run into people exercising in the morning, there's a kind of a horror of that kind of thing, socially between people. But more generally, we can think of the way the very structuring of time has changed throughout generations and millennia, really. Pre-capitalism, the experience of time was much more seasonal. As capitalism becomes to dominate the way that we live, we have to go to work, we have to clock in and out, we have to be at certain places at particular times. Time starts to be experienced much more differently. There's the invention of the weekend, which was a political movement done by unions to ensure that workers had some rest. There's also lots of evidence that shows that, like, kind of pre-capitalism, people didn't really sleep, from say 9 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning. They got up in the night and they did things and they were creative. The idea here is that, like, the need to be at work at certain times and to be at certain places and to be productive means that we see sleep now as a resource to invest in to make us more productive. Even notions of sleep and time here can be made to look strange through a sociological lens. So throughout the course, we'll be looking at all kinds of different examples of those kinds of things. But to get more kind of official, what is sociology? Well, as we kind of talk about in the textbook, it means lots of different things to different people, but essentially, very broadly, it's the scientific study of society. As sociologists, we do research, so it's a bit different from philosophy there. We go out into the world, we do research using quantitative and qualitative methods, gather stats, we do interviews, we do observations, we do all kinds of things like that, to kind of, normally with a specific research question, to go out and find out what's going on in the world. We use this combination of research, theories, and criticism to engage critically with the world in an attempt to understand it better and hopefully to make it better. One of the key things we look at is this kind of thing between agency and structure. that we'll talk about in some more detail a lot throughout the course. Very quickly, agency is the kind of autonomy that you have as an individual to put your choices into place. Structures are the things that can constrain that agency, but also enable it as well. Importantly, structures aren't always constraining. Things like laws, for instance, while they constrain what you do, they actually kind of also create some forms of freedom, in the sense that, like, say, for instance, murder is illegal. That actually kind of frees most of us up. It's restricting on murderers, but like for the good of society, that restriction's a good thing. From a more critical perspective, we look at structures as things like laws, religions, and even things like inequalities such as gender, race, and class, as things that provide opportunities for some people but constrain others, and we'll be looking at them in a lot more detail throughout the course as well. Essentially, sociology wants to understand how society functions and how power is distributed and how inequality works. We're particularly interested in how things stay the same and change, and sometimes, while this sounds like a little bit of a kind of hypocrisy, things can change and be the same at the same time. And again, we'll look at many examples of that throughout the course. But, you can see, for instance, how something like gender relations may change over the years. It's become, say, culturally more accepting for men to be more into grooming or to use moisturizer and things like that. While at the same time, men still tend to dominate public space, get paid more. So cultural things might change, while economic things might stay the same. Again, those kind of examples we'll be looking at critically throughout the course. So in terms of some of the official definitions of sociology, we've got a bunch of them here, but you can see very broadly, they're essentially a study of individuals in groups in a systematic way, grew out of the search for understanding associated with the industrial scientific revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. Ritzer talks about the sociology is the study of individuals in a social setting. Sociologists study the interrelationships between individuals, organisations, cultures, and societies. You can see that most of those kind of say the same thing. Study of society, the relationship between individuals and broader social structures. There's also a more politicised version of sociology. And this is important to understand because there's a kind of understanding of science, social science, and science more general, that it's somehow neutral. And really, a critical sociologist kind of have critical things to say about that. Here, the idea that the study of the social world can't really be neutral because it's done by humans that are brought up in their own kind of situations with their own biases, their own preferences, their own interests. So, for instance, my original kind of interest in sociology was about young people's life chances. I did a PhD about young people in Newcastle at 3 different schools and their orientations towards the future, their own individual interests and their more broader understandings of how the world was going. I was interested in that, I think, because in terms of my own transition from being a child to adult, it kind of took a while. I didn't really mark off the things of kind of getting a full-time job or a place to live by myself and all that for a while. I got an apprenticeship when I was younger and I didn't really like that. Then I went off and did other things and came to university. The transition was kind of pretty blurry. So I was interested also in class background. I grew up in Cessnock. I went to Mount View High. There was a lot of kind of mucking up going on at school and all that kind of stuff. When I came to university to study, I wanted to be a journalist to kind of take advantage of kind of my sporting career or whatever. But I discovered sociology, particularly the work of Paul Willis, who wrote an amazing book with the subtitle of Why Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs. And it kind of filled in some of the gaps from my own understanding of why I got an electrical apprenticeship back in the early 90s when I wasn't all that interested in it, to be honest. So I now started to get interested in class. So you can see here how my own personal biography influences the things that I'm interested in terms of now my sociological research. So that's not to say that sociological research is therefore necessarily biased. I use all kinds of scientific methods to go out in the world to kind of find data to answer the questions that I'm interested in. But what it means is that in terms of the different disciplines, there's often a different politics going on. Sociology in particular has been increasingly seen in Australia in particular as well as a kind of martial art, in what Pierre Bourdieu calls a martial art, a kind of a defense of the defenseless. Here, martial art, in terms of its philosophy, is often promoted as a kind of understanding of defense, not to be used as attack, and that it's a sociologist's job in that sense to go out into the world and to help people that are marginalised, discriminated against, in essence, to make the world better for everybody. Because as much sociology research has shown, that even those advantaged by being more privileged or having more money or being male in a patriarchal society can also have their own happiness and satisfaction and conviviality affected negatively by living in an unequal world. We'll look at that in some detail when we look at the weeks on class. So in this sense, sociology is an attempt to uncover the hidden, symbolic and taken for granted assumptions that underpin power relations. Zygmunt Bauman talks about this: to think sociology can render us more sensitive and tolerant of diversity. It can sharpen our senses and open our eyes to new horizons beyond our immediate experiences, in order that we can explore human conditions which hitherto have remained relatively invisible. So there's two things I want to kind of unpack with that one. Firstly is that we want you in class in particular to try and relate your own experiences to the concepts and things that we're teaching throughout the course. But we're not that interested in your opinion per se. We want you to start to think beyond your own immediate experiences and try sometimes to think through other people's eyes. That's one important thing. The other thing, and this is as kind of discussed in terms of the conspiracy theory stuff in the reading this week, is that we want to reveal the kind of hidden, invisible power relations in terms of how things work. But this moves us beyond kind of conspiracy theory thinking and a more critical understanding of who benefits and why. So again, the reading, I think, does a kind of decent job of unpacking that. So, by the end of the course, we want you to kind of be looking through what we call a sociological gaze, a way of thinking about the world that makes the normal look strange. And we'll do that also by teaching about the sociological imagination and its four components. Essentially, though, very broadly, we're looking at the link between individual experience and the contexts in which we work, live, and play. For many people that start this course, they actually can be affected by it. Sometimes it's a bit of a challenge to yourself to have your own preferences and common sense and things like that taken for granted. It's particularly challenging for those that are quite privileged. But for me, I experienced some of that myself when I was first learning about this, but it does allow us to kind of be more open to the world, be more open to the way other people live, and to experience those things in a kind of positive way. So, in terms of the sociological gaze, very broad questions we're asking you to kind of think about here. How do disparate things interrelate? How can we see the general in the particular and the particular in the general? So how do people, for instance, from similar backgrounds share similar experiences? How do we belong to certain categories and not others? And who kind of benefits from those things? Seeing the strange in the familiar, I've gone into that quite a bit already. We learn to see how society affects us in ways that we probably don't imagine as much if you weren't to study sociology. Also seeing those broader social structures, in our everyday choices. Our personal decisions are constantly shaped by society's norms, its institutions, its traditions, its religions, its social structures. Also, a way to think about the world is seeing marginality in crisis and how societies are kind of expressed. When bad things happen, how does it react? Who gets helped and who doesn't? You can see this around the kind of politics of bushfires or floods. Sometimes a particular place will get helped out more than others, may depend on who's in power, whether it's a marginal seat. All these kind of things matter in terms of that kind of stuff. We'll particularly later in the course look at Ulrich Beck's understanding of a risk society, where the concept of risk is an increasingly important way of thinking about the world. Okay, I'll leave part one there and come back with part two, sociological themes, in a sec.